I've got a question for the Chelsea fan base. Where are we going? What do we have to do this season? What is the objective this season that we have to meet? And then what's the objective next season? What do the next 3 years look like? Because in 3 years' time, that's 6 years into this project. And in the last 10 years, we have been in rapid decline. 7 of those years were under the Roman regime. We went from winning league titles to cups, to getting top 4, to scraping top 4, and now under Clear Lake, we're struggling to stay in the top 4. We're just spineless. They're both sides of the fan base that baffle me, because there's the proper Chelsea fossil fanatic ultras that pretend like everything was perfect before Clear Lake arrived, but that wasn't the case. All these guys out of nowhere now are talking about top standards, but where were your top standards in Roman's final term? Where were your top standards when we went 5 years without a league title? Where were your top standards when we went 4 years without a domestic trophy? Where were your top standards when the recruitment was terrible? Where were your top standards when the squad was harbouring deadwood? Where were your top standards then, when there were fans debating to keep Lampard just because he finished in the top 4 with a squad of experienced Premier League winning players? Where was your standards then? At that point, when Lampard came in, that's when the standards dropped. During COVID, the fan base became very complacent because no one held Roman to his own standards. No one. No one held him to that standard, really. Tuchel winning the Champions League just papered over the cracks, but that team was terrible, right? The first season under Clear Lake, when we finished 12th, the majority of those players were bought by Roman Abramovich. So he is partially to blame for that season because the majority of those players were bought by him. And before Tuchel came in, we were 9th. And after he left, we finished 12th. And the majority of those players, again, were bought by Roman Abramovich. Now, I'm not absolving this ownership of blame. No, I'll get to them. But let's be honest here. Us not holding Roman to his own standards is how we became so complacent for these guys to twang the fan base into believing all this process crap. There's no team in football that's actually dominated with this process stuff. Not one that's actually dominated. I'm talking about dominating. I'm not talking about 1 league title in 9 years or 2 league titles in 12 years. I'm talking about domination, like what City and Real Madrid are doing. No team has done what they've done by trusting a process. There's no team that's done that in modern football. None. I don't know how the fan base have been twanged into believing this. But again, that goes back to the complacency of the fan base under Roman. Because if we held him to his own standards, these guys wouldn't have been able to do that stuff. Because if they went to Real Madrid somehow, right? Let's say Bodie somehow became president of Real Madrid and all these guys went with him over there, and they finished 12th, they wouldn't have a second season. They wouldn't have one. Because the fan base would have held them to the standard. We didn't have the standards. And that became a problem because Roman had standards, but the problem was the people he had working at the club weren't good enough. They weren't good enough. What we got from the board in his final few years wasn't good enough, right? The recruitment was terrible. Again, the players weren't good enough. So there was still pressure. There was still a demand that we must win, but the personnel wasn't good enough. That was the problem. Now under these guys, there's no pressure. There's no pressure. There's no demand to win. There's no nothing. There's no nothing. It's just high PR but low performance. There's nothing here. There's nothing. Now to the other side of the fan base, the hyper-tolerant, pan-progressive mutants of the fan base. They're really relying on blind hope, really. It's blind hope. It's blind hope. It's really naive. I don't really get where it comes from. Every single problem you can point to Clear Lake, every single one, and even any attempt at defending them doesn't make them look good. It just makes them look worse. When they came in, they had over a month to get a sporting director. They failed on suspicion of excessive intervention, which is what was reported, that these guys are too involved. That was reportedly why we couldn't get a sporting director. And they decided to play sporting director and drag a manager who didn't want to be involved, because what we heard when Tuchel got sacked was that he didn't want to be involved in transfers, and that's why the ownership were annoyed. And there were other things as well. And they dragged him in anyway. He spent all that money, like 300 quid, sacked him a week after the transfer window. And that decision to sack him was made before we even signed Aubameyang. Aubameyang was for him. So we signed him after the decision, knowing we were going to get rid of him. And then we sacked Tuchel. So that Aubameyang signing in itself didn't make any sense. After we sacked Tuchel, we bring in an upcoming manager and throw him at the wolves in a club, destabilized, no structure. That immediately was stupid. Really, we should have gotten an interim. 3 months later, we bring in a technical director who wants Potter out. Then in the window, we blow out the squad to the extent where we have a dressing room that can't accommodate all the players. And then we hired Winstanley and Stewart, directors of football. And then 2 months later, Potter gets sacked. The caretaker manager leaves after 1 game. And then when we finally get an interim manager, we get that wrong. We hire a club legend who can't coach, and we barely win a game. We finish 12th, and then the top targets, Luis Enrique, Hansi Flick, and Julian Nagelsmann, turn down the job or are no longer wanted by the ownership. And Vivell, the technical director we bring in, leaves after 7 months. That is season 1 under Clear Lake. So in season 2, we bring in Pochettino because the other options are now Postecoglou or Vincent Kompany. So obviously Pochettino looks like the outstanding candidate. And that appointment annoyed me because I was stuck between whether that appointment was a stopgap or a piss take, because you're not going to win anything with Mauricio Pochettino. You're not going to dominate the Premier League with Mauricio Pochettino in charge. Good manager, but he's not good enough. And even the recruitment that season in defense and the goalkeeper was a joke. Pochettino thing goes sour, he leaves, but we all know why he actually left, because again, didn't agree with the transfer policy and he was fired. And even at the time, it wasn't a secret. Everybody knew. The fallout of this, how they say, oh, they didn't like his style of play and he didn't get top 4, but during the season, him finishing 6th was the only thing I was going to save his job. So I don't believe the top 4 stuff. They don't care about that. They were more keen on keeping Graham Potter than they were keeping Pochettino. They only got rid of Potter because the people at the stadium made it very clear, get rid of this manager now. That was that. That's the only reason they got rid of Potter. They would have kept him. They wanted to judge him by years. They didn't want to get rid of him. Now here we are this season. We go into the window. We don't address the problems. We don't get a goalkeeper. We don't sort out the defence. And we don't have backup in the midfield. Also, we don't have another striker. We have one striker, and that's Jackson. Mark Hughes not ready. So we still have the same problems. And we spent now up to 1.5 billion quid. And we are now in this transfer window. It took us 30 days just to sell a player, and we've not signed anyone. So where are we? I don't understand how you spend 1.5 billion quid and you're not at least competing for a title. Aston Villa finished above us last season. Tottenham finished above us last season. And now this season, we spent up to 1.5 billion quid and we can't even stay above Arsenal and Nottingham Forest. We can't stay above Nottingham Forest and we spent 1 billion quid. Come on, man. Come on. What process is that? The recruitment isn't as bad as it was in Roman's final term, but it's very hit and miss. Even if we get top 4, which I still believe we will get top 4, that doesn't alleviate all of our problems, because top 4 is just the point of recovery. We're on a road to recovery. This club is in rehab. After you recover, that's when the real work starts. So we've not even recovered. Getting top 4 is just recovery. Then we really have to bolster the squad. And we spent 1.5 billion quid and we still have a goalkeeper who's not good enough. We have defenders who can't defend. We have a backup fullback who's leaving 6 months after we signed him. We don't have backup midfielders. We have only one striker, so we're still in need of another striker. Going now, 8 years into this striker problem, alongside with a goalkeeping problem. And now we're linked with left wingers because a left winger that we overpaid for 2 years ago is suspended after a doping test. So how do you still have all of these problems? That's the thing. We shouldn't have these problems. So when people make excuses and say, oh, the squad's young, yeah, whose fault is that? Whose recruitment policy was that? And even then, that's not even an excuse, because an under 24 policy, you can buy players who are 23, 22 that have experience. So there's not an excuse either. Any problem you have points to Clear Lake. So again, I have the question, where are we going?